But his modest size, less than commanding physical skills, and above all, remarkable will, made him most useful as a stand-in for the opposing team.
It just breaks your heart to do it, but it didn't matter how hard you hit Dick Nixon. He was right in there scrapping you like he was going to make a touchdown or something.
Natural sociability may not have been Richard Nixon's strong suit, but he knew what appealed to his peers, and he won the student body presidency on a promise to allow student dancing on this very Quaker campus. At Whittier, Richard Nixon felt a kinship with other hard-working boys like himself. The sons of the more prosperous local families had long joined a college society called the Franklins. Nixon now helped organize the Orthogonians, an intentionally more informal society of the diligent have-nots. The easy success of the privileged. He'd continue to resent it for the rest of his life.
I think he had a kind of an inner feeling somehow, which he expressed many times, that many people who had not worked as hard as he did and who were not as serious as he were had got ahead more easily. And I think he had a kind of a built-in antagonism towards that kind of person.
In Richard's third year of college, Harold died from the tuberculosis. Just before his death, he had returned to Whittier, and for his mother's birthday, asked Richard to drive him to town to buy her a mixer.
So they brought it home, and the next morning, my mother's birthday, Harold was determined to get up and give her the mixer. And he died in her arms right there. They couldn't talk about that anymore.
The family was devastated by the loss. According to his mother, Hannah, Richard sank into a deep, impenetrable silence. And from then on, he tried to be three sons in one. In fact, the perfect son to ease his parents' loss. In June of 1934, Richard Nixon graduated from Whittier, a four-year honor student. He applied for and received a scholarship to Duke University Law School. The competition here was much tougher than any he'd faced before, but his drive propelled him to third in his class. Richard Nixon was 24 now, with his future course unset. He knew a life in politics appealed to him. He'd been a master politician since high school, but he didn't know how to go about it. One alternate path he tried would have changed his future dramatically. He attempted to join the FBI, but he never heard back and assumed he'd been turned down. Until many years later, when J. Edgar Hoover investigated and discovered that the position had been eliminated at the time. Richard Nixon, armed with a succession of academic accomplishments and honors, was lost. No big city law firms clamored for his services, and he had no group of close friends he was determined to follow. So, Richard Nixon would make as his next step forward a return back to where he started. Whittier, California. 24-year-old Richard Nixon returned here in 1937, fresh out of law school, to join the small firm of Wingert and Bewley. Now he began the life of a local attorney. According to the woman he'd one day marry, he was also the eligible new young man in town.
I asked her, what was Daddy like? And she said, oh, he was the darling bachelor around town. All the mothers were getting in the act and asking him to dinner. I mean, he was president of the Kiwanis and the 2030 Club, and he was making a name. He was the deputy city attorney, so he was considered a prize in Whittier.
For pleasure, he joined the local theater group, where he met a popular young teacher, as hardworking as he was, Thelma Pat Ryan. He was taken with Pat immediately and made an uncharacteristically brash move.
He proposed the first night he met her. And he's a shy, sensitive person, not usually impulsive, but he told her after they'd met at tryouts for a little theater play, he said, you may not believe this, but I'm going to marry you someday.
They began to see each other, but Pat was reluctant to let her Whittier students see this part of her private life.
They would most often go to the beach or leave the town because she's fiercely independent and she didn't want anyone watching what she was doing.
Outings often included Richard's younger brother, Ed.
When I met Pat, I was really taken by this exuberant school teacher with the flaming red hair and legs that could make her run faster than I could. And, you know, here I was, 9 years old or so, and she could outrun me, and I thought I was pretty fast. Well, they went to the beach, into the mountains and places, and occasionally they'd take me along. And Pat was a real buddy.
During the courtship, Richard Nixon wrote to Pat.
When the winds blow and the rains fall and the sun shines through the clouds, as it is now, I still resolve, as I did then, that nothing so fine ever happened to me or anyone else as falling in love with thee, my dearest heart.
On the 21st of June, 1940, Richard Nixon's earlier certainty came true. He and Pat Ryan were married at the Mission Inn in Riverside, California. And now it was time to take the steps that would bring Richard Nixon closer to politics. In early 1942, with America at war, he and Pat moved to Washington, where he got a job with the Office of Price Administration. It was Richard Nixon's first taste of bureaucratic Washington, and the OPA was stifling to him. As a Quaker, and also as a government employee, Richard Nixon could have refused war service. As a future politician, no such option was available. He knew this war had to be fought, and so he joined the Navy in 1942. Nixon's decision was painful to his mother. Besides the real danger he would face, he'd be leaving the Quaker path of pacifism.
My mother's view of that was, I wish he didn't have to go, but understand that he's made the decision and that's as it should be. Because free will is the basic tenet of Quakerism. You have to decide yourself, make your own commitment, and then carry through.
He entered the Navy as a lieutenant junior grade and opted for sea duty a few months later. Nixon became a supply officer in the South Pacific. When new shipments would come in, he'd manage to get and distribute meat and beer to the very appreciative men at what became known as Nick's Hamburger Stand. It was a period that changed him forever.
In the Navy, Richard Nixon got to know his fellow Americans in a way that he had not previously. He had been a college student and then a small-town lawyer. And that was a very good and very broadening experience for Nixon. And he did a good job as an officer leading this small supply detachment.
It was also in the Navy that Richard Nixon learned a skill quite out of keeping with his past: poker.
And he became very good at poker, very disciplined poker player, and a great bluffer. We have an account of his looking into a pair of aces up. He had a pair of deuces up, and he bluffed the aces out of a big pot. He came home with $10,000, and he used that money to finance his first political campaign.
Richard Nixon stayed with the Navy doing expert legal work at the war's end. VJ Day found him and thousands of others in Times Square in New York City.
It's official. It's all over. It's total victory.
He was still in the East when he received a call later that year from Whittier asking if he wanted to become the Republican candidate for Congress from the 12th District. The caller was a local banker, Herman Perry.
My father was a frustrated politician. He couldn't run for anything because he was working for a bank. He took out his dreams on Dick Nixon. He looked upon Dick Nixon as an adopted son. He saw in Dick Nixon a young fellow who, with a war record, just coming back from the service, would look good politically, and they got behind him.
Nixon's backers in Whittier wanted to oust the district's 5-term congressman, Jerry Voorhees. Voorhees was the perfect representative of the New Deal and all its government programs, anathema to many of the small businessmen of Southern California.
I'd suggest that he contact his servant.
Much of every congressman's day is taken up by the visits of lobbyists and constituents. Since one of the
Voorhees was not a sitting duck. He was a well-respected politician who could serve as a model for the role of congressman.
Most important and most demanding of his duties is committee work.
He had become fairly popular, Voorhees had, and he was